Hello, everybody. Welcome in, welcome in, welcome in. I'm glad to see you all here today. My name is Nick, and welcome back to Conversations with Authors. Today we bring to you Derecka Purnell, the author of Becoming Abolitionists. But before we get to our authors, our conversation properly, allow me to introduce to you Book Passage. If you've seen one of these events before, well then welcome back. But if you're completely new here, as I suspect many of you are, then Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area. And as we run book talks just like these many times throughout the week. Some of them are in person at our Corte Madero or San Francisco store, but a great many of them are online, just like these. And as we are streaming on YouTube, and will continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. Not only does it support us completely for free to you, but it allows you to know every time we go live, particularly if you click that notification bell directly next to the subscribe button. It's very useful for everybody, and it helps you not miss out on an author event you might really enjoy. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events, or you'd like the idea of subscribing to our e-newsletter, you can find both of them at bookpassage.com, in addition to all of our other content that's coming up. If you'd like to check out any of our speakers' books tonight, which again is Becoming Abolitionists, or anything else that we happen to mention, you can find it at bookpassage.com or from the link that is at the very, very top of the description box just below the video. And finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat. It is the only way to get questions to anybody who's speaking here today. I will see them and copy them over, and although we don't always get to every question, they are always greatly appreciated. Now, allow me to introduce Derecka Purnell, who is a human rights lawyer, writer, and organizer. She received her JD from Harvard Law School and works to end police and prison violence by providing legal assistance, research, and training to community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. Her work and writing has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, The Atlantic, Boston Globe, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, The Appeal, Truth Out, Slate, and many, many more. Derecka is currently a columnist for The Guardian. In conversation tonight, we have V, who was formerly known as Eve Ensler. They are the Tony Award-winning playwright and author of the Obie Award theatrical phenomenon, The Vagina Monologues, which has been translated into 48 languages, performed in 140 countries, along with many other plays. She is the author of a number of books, including her latest bestsellers, The Apology and In the Body of the World, as well as the New York Times bestseller, I Am an Emotional Creature. She's the founder of V-Day, the 22-year-old global activist movement which has raised over $120 million to end violence against all women, both cisgender and transgender, against those who hold fluid identities, against non-binary people, girls, and the planet. She writes regularly for The Guardian. Thank you to everybody that happened to come out here tonight. Thank you for everybody who's out in the audience. Allow me to introduce Derecka and V. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick, so much for those wonderful introductions. I'm so happy to be here this evening at Book Passage, which is one of my favorite places. I've done so many events here over the years, and it's a thrill to be back, if only virtually. And thank you to everybody who's joining us tonight. I am so thrilled to be talking to Derecka Purnell. I'm in awe of her. I think she is one of the most brilliant, young, radical visionaries of our time, with a keen sense of community, process, and inclusion. Long before Derecka wrote this astonishing book, I was a huge fan of her writing. I eagerly looked forward to her pieces in the New York Times, The Guardian, Teen Vogue. Her voice is clear, provocative, truly progressive, original, and radical. And by that, I mean, I feel she is always seeking out the root causes of things, getting behind the obvious, easy answers to make real transformative change. You can feel in everything she writes that she is guided by a relentless passion for justice and freedom. For me, Becoming Abolitionist was a very profound read, and it answered many questions, but more importantly, it pushed me to ask questions, to examine the parts of me that were still hanging back from imagining a world without the police. Because rather than judging us in her book, Derecka bravely reveals her own journey to abolition. We are thus invited to take our own. Becoming Abolitionist shows us that abolition is not solely about getting rid of the police, but a commitment to create and support different answers to the problem of harm in society. And most excitingly, an opportunity to release and eliminate harm in the first place. As Mary Retta at the Cut said about her book, she said her book asks, what would a world without police look like? Is that something we're able to imagine and willing to fight for? These are the questions that Purnell's debut book, Becoming Abolitionists, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom, so artfully grapples with. Through deft historical research, political analysis, and gutting prose, the book uses a variety of approaches, part autobiographical, part textbook, part personal musing, to map Purnell's complex and fulfilling political evolution. Purnell's writing similarly pushes readers to expand their conception of what a police-free world could look like. This book is called Becoming Abolitionists. Lately, becoming has become one of my favorite words. It implies that we are in process, evolution, on a journey. It acknowledges that no one has all the answers and that each of us are imperfect and struggling to evolve our higher selves and a more equal, fair, and caring world. That is what I love about this book. We are on a continuum of learning, transforming, and emerging from the violence and horror of a racist, murderous past. So, Derecka, let's begin at the beginning. You take a powerful and substantial journey in this book. Tell us a little bit about who you were as a child, where you grew up, and what were your initial impressions of the police?
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much for speaking with me tonight. It literally means just the world. Like, I've said that to you several times, and I really mean it. Even after you initially read the book, the phone call the call that you gave me, I remember walking in the middle of New York City, and I told you that I'm easily overwhelmed by New York City because I'm so Midwesterner and I'm used to like smaller cities. So I was just like on the phone, semi-lost, so emotional, so excited that you had taken time to read the book and wanted to figure out how we can use it towards our liberation work. So just thank you so much for all of your work, your writing, and your kind words, and your advocacy, and your activism. So thank you. And your fly glasses. Thank you for that too. They're very fly. Wow. Okay. So where am I from? About my childhood, my early impressions about the police. Yeah. So I'm from St. Louis. Like I said, I'm horribly Midwestern. I don't realize it until I travel outside the Midwest. I grew up in South St. Louis, right on the edge of the border of downtown. So you can see the arch from my neighborhood and from the playground and the recreation centers. I think it wasn't as if I had well-formed ideas about the police. What I had the most were feelings, right? I knew that my mom had some friends who were police. I also knew that when police would show up, there would be a lot of fear about what might happen, right? Is someone gonna, take us from our home? Is someone gonna have to leave the home because of an argument, right? Is someone gonna get arrested? So there was all this uncertainty, but I took for granted their presence, actually. I just assumed that police were sort of normal, that we have teachers, we have mail carriers. It's sort of how you learn it at school. Even one time when I was in elementary school, there were a few cops who came to our class and they would tell us about their work and show off their guns. I was like third grade, I was like a kid. So they were presented as something that we're supposed to have. And the more that I grew, the more that I realized, like, oh, wow, I think my family's poor. I think this neighborhood is exploited. I noticed that police are here more often than what their presence in other neighborhoods. My friends started getting, locked up. They started facing arrest. They avoided cops. We had to run for cops. We had to call on cops. There were just so many messy moments where our lines just didn't necessarily comport with what we understood to be. So we knew them to be chasing us, to be problematic. But then we just also didn't know what else to do. So that was sort of like my childhood. I grew up in a neighborhood where half of the community were East African refugees. And so it gave me a lens to understand the world through internationalism. And I had to come to understand what solidarity meant, especially for a lot of the Muslim girls in my neighborhood. So I just considered them to be like friends who were from Africa, from this other place, you know, who taught me how to curse in Arabic and Swahili, right? These are the people who I knew. And yeah, and just watch different people have different relationships to the law and have to be safe and have to make sure that their family could be provided for under the guise. And so it was quite messy. And no matter sort of what happened in that neighborhood, I remember, especially in my home, having to call 911 because there just wasn't other options to rely on. If there's a fight, you don't call a therapist, right? You call 911, right? If there's a nosebleed, right? You don't have a primary care physician. You call the fire department to come help with our nosebleeds, right? So it just became a regular habit and a regular practice until later I was starting to understand the political analysis about why, even though we relied on the police, there was still this antagonism towards the institution.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have a really profound thing that you say in the introduction, and I just want to read it if that's okay with you,
Of course,
because
please.
I would like you to like expound on it too. Initially, the notion of police abolition repulsed me. The idea seemed like it was created by white activists who did not know the violence that I knew, that I had felt. At the time, I considered abolition to be pejoratively utopic. I'd seen too much sexual violence and had buried too many friends to consider getting rid of the police in St. Louis, let alone across the nation. I still lose people to violence. Sapphire, John, Greg, Brianna, Monty, Corey, Christopher, Jarrell. Sometimes I reread our text messages to laugh again and cry. But over time, I came to realize that in reality, the police were a placebo. I love that. Calling them felt like something, as the legal scholar Michelle Alexander explains, and something feels like everything when your other option is nothing. Police couldn't do what we really needed. They could not heal relationships or provide jobs. They did not interrupt violence. They escalated it. We were usually afraid when we called. When the cops arrived, I was silenced, threatened with detention, or removed from my home. Today, more than 15 years later, St. Louis has more police per capita than most cities in the US. My old neighborhood still lacks quality food, employment, schools, healthcare, and air, all of which increases the risk of violence and our reliance on police. And instead of improving the quality of the neighborhood, St. Louis, which has the highest rate of killings by police among the largest cities in the US, spends more money on police. Yet, I feared letting go. I thought we needed them. I thought they just needed to be reformed until August 9, 2014, when police officer Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Brown had a funeral, Wilson had a wedding. Most police officers just continued to live their lives after filling the streets with blood and bone. I felt that paragraph was just so, that whole section was really just such a profound opening. And I would love you just maybe to share, like, okay, unpack that, and also share, like, what were 3 big moments in the transformation of your becoming?
Wow. Yes. So when you hear it back, it's like it feels so linear, you know, as if I was a reformer and then this one particular thing happened. Then I became an abolitionist. It was actually quite messy. And as you move out the introduction and into the chapters, you see the back and forth, you see some of the confusion, the curiosity, right? But in that, just wow. It's something else to work on the book for so long and then to know that it's in the world and that paragraph is no longer on your computer on the Google Doc.
Totally.
And it's printed, right? It's printed. So that's just
entering other people's minds and consciousness.
Yes, exactly. So there are a lot of moments that I think pushed me closer to abolition, right? And initially, when I first started writing the book, I started thinking about, okay, when were my conceptions of justice forming? And I realized that it wasn't as if just these national tragedies like pushed me closer to abolition, but actually the resistance to them. And so, for example, when I was in high school, I remember, when Sean Bell was killed in New York City. And I was just like, wow, how could this unarmed Black man be killed in his car the night before his wedding? Right. And I thought it was just horrible, tragic mistake. I had no idea at the time how many people police killed, who they interacted with. It just seemed like such an anomaly. And what's so sad is that I think across generations, there's so many people who have that moment. You know, for some people, it's like Abner Louima, and for other people, it's Michael Brown, right? And for me, initially, it was Sean Bell. It was the first time I felt compelled to like say something about police killings. It just was just so shocking. So that was just huge. The second major moment was Hurricane Katrina. You know, watching the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, it was just horrible. It was just horrible. It was the first time I learned the word looting, right, was in this context. The people who I heard from the most were law enforcement officials who were getting on camera saying, hey, if you loot, you're going to go to jail. To see signs that say, you know, once you start looting, we'll start shooting. To learn that there were armed militias who were stopping Black Hurricane Katrina survivors from leaving New Orleans and entering to the surrounding municipalities and suburbs of that city. You know, to witness that, to hear Kanye West get on television and say George Bush doesn't like Black people or hates Black people. That was also the first time I remember something going viral, right? Like this clip, this comment, trying to make sense, like, oh man, this is just a thing in the South. But, you know, viewing law enforcement as the institution primarily tasked with locking up these poor Black people in the aftermath of the storm, it felt very different from what I understood relief to be, or disaster emergency response. It was like, oh, they're like trying to arrest people. Man, 3 Jenna 6, I talk about a lot, is hugely influential. Also took place in Louisiana. I mean, there was a group of Black kids who were being just racially harassed by lots of like young white racist kids and people in their family. And at one point, a group of white kids hung a noose on a tree after a Black kid asked to sit there. It was called like the white tree. And then there were a bunch of fights that ensued. And at one fight, one of the Black boys kicked a white kid in the face with his tennis shoe. And so a prosecutor charged him with assault with a deadly weapon. And the deadly weapon was a sneaker. And again, it was just how is this happening? If these moments felt like so random, civil rights was just, well, I thought we passed a certain point. And so watching these Black kids get prosecuted, watching these Black people drown, fill up football stadiums, you know, be threatened with arrest, learning about Sean Bell. I mean, then there's Trayvon Martin, there's Jordan Davis. These moments just keep happening. And in the aftermath, watching the resistance to it, watching people say, no, we're not going to tolerate that. We're going to march on this town. We're going to organize mutual aid. We're going to fight for George Zimmerman's arrest. I mean, each of these moments, I would say, certainly politicized me and helped me to think more critically about the world and who I wanted to be in it.
Well, you talk about, you quote Elizabeth Alexander, who calls your generation the Trayvon Generation. And I think that's so profound. I would love you to explain a little more depth what that means. Like how has that shaped and determined your view of the world?
Yeah, of course. Well, Alexander describes the Trayvon Generation as this group of sort of young, I'm assuming she's talking about Black people who have been witnessing all of this racial tragedy in terms of homicides from vigilantes and from law enforcement. And then we watch them on a loop constantly, right? You know, my partner now, he says this is Black death gone viral, right? This is how he describes it. So we're constantly exposed to these images, to this footage, to these stories. And what I find interesting, especially right now, is that the backlash I've heard to abolitionists, especially to the Trayvon generation, right? Like the backlash to that has been so interesting because many of us who espouse abolitionist politics right now, our first major movement was trying to get someone arrested. We were trying to get George Zimmerman arrested. We got 1 million people to sign petitions to put someone in a cage for murdering a young Black boy. We were making demands on law enforcement. We were trying to stop racial profiling and improve relationships with police, right? So many of our entry points to criminal justice work was using the very same carceral institutions that a decade later we're trying to tear down. And so it's I find it sad and ironic that we get critiqued for not being realistic, for not being serious, for being utopic, right? For not taking time to work within the system. And that's just us, that's just my generation, right? For a decade, we've been trying to work within this system. And for people who've been doing this work for much longer than we have, who have been trying to shut down prisons, who are trying to free people from jails. I mean, those people have also at one point were trying to work within the carceral system, relying on police to solve problems. And so it's those people, those groups of people, especially the Trayvon generation, the generation before us, you know, like we know that intimately, right? We know that intimately. And so I think how she describes it is so, so beautiful. And I think just to carry that on through, it's like, yeah, it's not 2020 when you hear people saying defund the police. It didn't come from anywhere. A lot of those people 10 years ago probably were trying to get more resources through body cameras or through training. And now we're realizing we need to reduce our reliance on this institution and get to the root causes of harm.
And I think that's so profound and true. And I want to even go back further, because in the book you say this, which I think is so important, looking at the history of policing, right? Yeah. Policing was and is deeply connected to the control of land, labor, and people who threatened white supremacy. The people who chose the police were the same people who drafted the Constitution, who started the wars, who owned slaves, who possessed property, who had the most to lose if oppressed people ever decided to revolt, wealthy white men. And rather than unifying and organizing against the concentrated wealth of this class, the rest of us have been tricked into demanding that the police protect us too. They cannot. The journey to get rid of police is the journey to create a new world. Abolition is a dream of freedom. I think that is so critical. I mean, I was thinking today that abolition is a form of reparation, right?
Absolutely.
It's a form of, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that and the history of policing and how that's connected to what's happening now.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, I say this a little bit in the book, but I had known, I guess, just maybe from being around, from having parents, a mom and a grandmom and an uncle who were, I wouldn't call them activists, but they know Black history. They consider themselves relatively political in one sense, right? And so I had heard that police had come from slave patrols. I had friends who called them slave catchers. But when I started reading and understanding the actual history of police, it shocked me. It surprised me. It was like, oh, wait. There's actually this origin story of police that is rooted in slave patrols and also in the disruption of labor and also in the control of women and also in the maintenance of borders, right? Police emerged from all of these systems that oppress people. And so I was, surprised by that history. I was shocked by that history. And the more that I came to understand it, especially in the slave context, I think what made, where do I even start? I think that what impacted me is that the creation of police in the slave patrol context wasn't just because slavery needed to happen, right? There were people, Black people, African peoples who were free. And because they were captured, right, they had to be oppressed. They had to be patrolled. They had to be surveilled because they kept resisting, right? So why do you need slave catchers to go and catch slaves? Because they're running away, right? Why do you need a system of surveillance? Because you need to watch how people are devising plans to figure out how they're going to escape. You need to figure out how to spoil rebellions and uprisings. You need to create a system of informants because these plans were happening in secretive hallways and backyards, right? So this entire system of maintaining slavery was in response to people's will and determination to get free. right? And the more that people resist it, the more you have to figure out, well, we have to cuff you because you're going to run away. We have to put you in cages because you're going to escape. We have to punish you and lynch you, and to prove that if you run away, you're not going to go, far, right? To teach a lesson to other people. And so I found that it wasn't just that it was that it grew out of slavery, but it actually grew in response to our resistance, right? So abolition is in that tradition of resistance, because we still have that tradition of repression, unfortunately. I thought what I also found interesting was how the courts tried to reform slave patrols to make them more gentle when they were going to retrieve property, right? It's just like, well, you can't give a slave more than 50 lashes, more than 30 lashes. So this, ever since police have been created, there has always been a movement to reform it, right? And so we didn't need like better slave overseers. We needed the eradication of slavery as an institution, right? So how do we get to the root causes of what police are then tasked with maintaining, right? That is absolutely a project of abolition.
Yes, and it seems to me that the tracks of policing, like once you have that history, right? That's karmic infiltration that you will never get rid of, right?
Yeah,
Reform doesn't get rid of that karmic infiltration, right? And I think that's so profound in terms of like, what do we? Okay, so I think I want to jump to okay, so this is the thing. When I talk about the fact that about abolishing the police, of course, the first thing people always say, and is, what will you do with rapists? What will you do with murderers? What will you do with psychopaths? Will you just let them roam the streets and continue to do heinous crimes? Like, what are you going to do with those people? And you have a great answer in your book, but I want you to answer it personally.
I want to know what you think the great answer is in the book.
You said policing cannot even fix what many of us might fear most. Yeah. People often ask me, what will we do with murderers and rapists? Which ones? The police kill about 1,000 people every year and potentially assault, threaten, and harm hundreds of thousands more. After excessive force, sexual misconduct is the second most common complaint against cops. Many people are afraid to call the police when they suffer these harms because they fear the police will hurt them too. Thousands of rape survivors refuse to call the police, worried about not being believed or about being reassaulted, or concerned that their rape kit would sit unexamined for years. And I will also add to that they'll be treated roughly, that they'll be gaslit. In 3 major cities, less than 4% of calls to the police are for violent crimes. Currently, the arrest rate for homicides have declined from 80% to 60%, and cops frequently arrest and force confessions out of the wrong people. So now continue. Yes.
Yes. I mean, it's so sad, because murder is, people don't want to be murdered. I understand that. And I haven't met any abolitionist organizer who is just like, let's get rid of the police overnight, let all the murderers run free. No. So even with the police that we have now, I said it's 60%. In some places, especially in highly exploited Black communities, the murder clearance rate is like 30 to 35%, which means that someone was arrested and charged, not even convicted, just arrested and charged, right? And so by putting someone in a carceral system, you're making them more precarious to be a victim of violence or someone who causes harm to someone else, right? And what's even more frustrating is that when I wrote the book and said police kill about 1,000 people a year, about 3 people a day, apparently that's an undercount. Just like 2 weeks ago, the New York Times reported that there's been a 17,000 person undercount of how many people the police have killed in the last 4 decades because of their collusion with medical examiners, not writing some of the deaths as homicides attributed to the police. So the police kill more than 1,000 people every year. George Floyd is a prime example. When he was first murdered, the press release announced that he died because of a medical emergency. Come on, right? Well, I didn't know that someone kneeling their knee into your neck for 9 minutes was a medical emergency. The police create the emergency and then say that they're the solution to it. So yes. So of the 15,000 people who are killed every year, I think that we have the resources to figure out why that happens. Why do people kill people? And the more we dig into that research, it's not as if everyone's sitting around waiting to murder people, right? People kill people because of self-defense, right? People kill people because they're afraid and they're fearing retaliation, so they preemptively strike. I mean, our country does that with drones all the time, but there's no police to call anyone in the White House who's droning people in other countries to preemptively strike them. But when people do that for interpersonal reasons to stop harm, then it's like, oh, no, that's a bad person, that's a murderer. I digress. People, especially men, kill women because they want to control their sexuality. They want to control who they're sleeping with. They don't want them to leave relationships. The police can't solve that, right? The police cannot fight toxic masculinity, right? The police can't teach men not to kill as a result of a potential heartbreak or shame. And what's so scary is that among law enforcement, there's domestic violence rates 2 to 4 times higher than the general population. So what about the partners of the police? And so if we're relying on police to then solve our domestic violence disputes, and then they can go home and be abusive to their own partners, that doesn't seem to be getting to the heart of the problem. When we know that, well, when especially women have more resources, more agency, childcare, better pay, they're able to make decisions about what kinds of relationships they can be in. But instead of investing in that, we still have a pay gap, right? We still have a pay gap, right? It's harder, Black women, brown women call the police more for domestic violence disputes that could potentially lead to their murder, for example, than white women, because white women have more resources to leave. They call friends, they call therapy, they have a network, they can go to a hotel, they can leave a city. There's so many other options when you have more resources, because it can increase the kinds of agency that you have. And so it's so sad because police are the cheap way out, and they're being sold as the primary golden ticket for survivors of violence. And it's just simply not true.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about transition, right? Because I think we're always living in 2 time realities, right? Where we want to be going and where we are, right? And I've always felt, for example, as somebody who's been working to end violence against women, I've always felt very ambivalent, for example, about building more shelters for battered women. As I've never understood why, for example, women should leave the house when it was men who were committing the violence, right? So I feel in our movement, we've had to work on 2 fronts in 2 different realities of time, protecting women in the present, while simultaneously uprooting patriarchy and the reasons for the violence, right? And it seems to me that the same thing is called for in a transition to abolition, right? And I would love you to talk about that transition. What does that transition look like, right?
Yes. So I have my own ideas and, commitments that I'm working with other people to figure out what that means, what that looks like. And so the first thing I'll say is that I hope that lots of people who are thinking about abolition, who are dreaming about abolition, who are fighting for abolition alongside all these other paradigms for justice, that we get to decide what that means for us. Right. So, for example, for the group of people I'm working with, it looks like a lot of different things. One of them is shifting resources from the police. Now, one response that I get to abolition, I'll hear people say, Derecka, I'm so on board with abolition. I think that we should fix all the other things first. We should give people jobs and resources, whatever, and then start defunding the police. I am very nervous about that because historically, when there has been investments in other resources that strengthen our community, strengthen our ability to live with dignity and love and respect, police have disrupted that. So we need to remove resources from police. We need to start shrinking our reliance on police, right? We need to make sure that we're not continuing to invest in body cameras and more training, right? To give them more tools, more basketball camps, more police athletic leagues. We need to first start decoupling and reducing our encounters with police. So that's one concrete thing that we can do. There's so many different ways to do that. One way I talk about in the book is just examining 911 calls. right? Why do people even think they need to call the police in the first place, right?
Mhm.
That's like very, very simple stuff that we have time and we have resources to do. Why do people think they need police? What actually are they calling for? What's at the heart of these disputes? So that's something we can start doing, analyzing 911 calls, decreasing patrol, fighting against surveillance technology, right? So these are like police-centered things that we can figure out. We also then have to figure out, well, what are the reasons why people think that they need police over time? That's just not reducible to 911 calls. And that is an exciting project because there's so many reasons, so many ways that we can invest in our relationships. And so I don't see police abolition as being like one simple transition. What I imagine is that it's going to happen in different places at different times. People are going to figure out, how do we start reducing our reliance on police and also building up all these other things that we need to get free. So I think of universal childcare, for example. I think universal childcare will be a revolutionary introduction in this country for lots of reasons. One reason is related to what I said earlier. We get to then give people more agency to figure out what jobs they want to take, what relationships they want to be in, what kind of schooling they want to be in. And it's like, well, if we can eliminate harm by increasing agency through childcare, through student debt cancellation, through consumer debt cancellation in many cases, especially with payday loans, if we care about poor and working class women in this country, then how do we make sure that we fight for those policies so people aren't staying in relationships because they need resources, because they need a house, right? Because they need healthcare benefits. So some of the bigger sweeping policy changes we have to continue to fight for, because that increases our agency and decreases violence and decreases our precarity, right? So there's just endless. And earlier I guess now last year, I'm like mixing up the years, Miriam Kaba called for the complete halving of the police. So right now we're a little under 1 million cops there. Right now we can cut half of the police and then figure out how to start using that money to invest in some of the things I just talked about. There's organizations like Dream Defenders who are trying to fight militarization, close prisons in Florida. There are dissenters who are also fighting against militarization. There's a Green New Deal, there's a Red Deal. All of these policies that people are fighting for will increase our agency, will decrease vulnerability, which then decrease violence. And so that transition can look a lot of different places depending on who you're organizing with and what you're passionate about. But there's a lot of room for people to figure that out together.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I love, that it's all of our project, right?
Yes.
This is a community collective project. In the book you say, and I think this is so interesting, what's sad is that people claim that poor Black communities need the police the most to protect them, but this is not quite true. Capitalists need policing the most to protect their property, billions, businesses, and borders by arresting the people whom they've exploited, excluded, and extracted from the most. I would love you to talk about that some more, because I think people have, I think the way the media operates and the way white supremacy operates is that we do this opposite world, right? Yes. Claiming that poor Black communities need the police the most, when in fact, it's people who are capitalists and oppressing that need it. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so right now there are so many workers who are striking. Mm-hmm. And this is true all over the world. Mm-hmm. Whenever the police show up, whose side are the police on? Right? Who are they facing? Who are the police facing? Are the police facing the corporations, or are they facing the people who are trying to get better pay or healthcare or time off? Mm-hmm. So it's just, if we look throughout history, for any progressive fight for change, from gay rights movement, ACT UP, AIDS activism, anti-war activism, any progressive fight in the history of this country, the police have always faced the people fighting for change. They've always protected corporations, militarism, racism. They joined the lynch mobs. They refused to prosecute Klansmen. I mean, the list literally goes on. And so they are their own PR, right? They are their own PR. And so I'm thinking about how University of Michigan last year, when student workers went on strike and they tried to organize and say, hey, look at this COVID situation. This pandemic is not safe. We want to make sure that, students are protected, that grad student workers are getting paid. The university said, okay, police, these are public workers. They're not supposed to unionize. Feel free to arrest them.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so it's so tragic that isn't then caught up in a broad critique of policing. And sometimes we'll be reduced like, oh, this is a labor issue, or this is like a lynching or a race issue. But no, it's not true. This is a policing problem. And it's been consistent throughout our history. Standing Rock is another example.
Yep, exactly.
Who did the police show up to protect? They show up to protect the water protectors who are saying, don't poison our water with oil and spill that's going to wreck this land even further. No, they shot water cannons at water protectors to defend the destruction of the earth.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. I mean, it's horrible.
Look, I'm older than you. Like I've been here at the, whether it was the civil rights movement, whether it was the anti-Vietnam movement, I know which side the police have been on. And it was not very on my side, never on the side we were fighting for. So yes. And I think that is a positional reality, right? Mm-hmm. That is like, who are the police there to defend? Right. And I think that's the biggest question we should be asking ourselves. Who are they protecting? Yeah. I just want to say to everybody listening, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. Actually, a woman named Janet Weinberg asked you, and this is related to what you were talking about earlier, but she says in other countries, police must be older and have longer training program. If we followed them, would we have a police force that treated citizens better?
Oh, I love this question so much, primarily because I initially felt similar. I assumed that, other countries do so much better around police, right? Clearly we can learn from them. They kill fewer people. The UK has probably killed, 30 people in the last 30 years compared to maybe 30,000 people in the US. So I looked and I hope that other countries would provide some relief. And I think this is in chapter 3, where I speak to this directly. The more I learned about the history of police in other countries, what I learned is that unlike in the US, where they emerged from slave patrols, they just emerged from colonial projects in other places. So the UK, for example, we get police in the UK because they're practicing how to colonize Ireland. Mm-hmm. And so it's a product, right? It comes out of colonization. If you look at the police in India are there because of the British colonization period. Same is true for the police in Nigeria. They maintained the policing structure when they were under British occupation. Same for the Netherlands. The Netherlands gets its national police force after it's colonized. So all of these countries that we could theoretically look to for more guidance, it's not as if their police developed organically. They developed as responses to colonialism and resistance to colonialism. The reason why especially South Africa is another example too. We get a national police force in South Africa because of apartheid. And so we know that one way it's easier to colonize people is to break them up into districts, right? And if you look in the United States, we have police districts because it's easier to control smaller amounts of people and to have a central command that way. And so we could start policing the police in the Netherlands. But then we'll just risk replicating what the police in the Netherlands do, which is maintain colonization, discriminate against North African and other refugees who come to that country, discriminate against women. They're just replicating other forms of oppression. And it's not the same ones in the United States, but they have their own unique systems that they're trying to enforce. And we can't just simply copy and paste that. Right. That's why in other countries, we may not hear an abolition movement around police, but we'll hear decolonization, which also calls into question the idea of policing in those places.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I love the most about this book is it's really calling for a project of the imagination. And I think what we need the most right now in every respect, whether it's finding a way out of this capitalist tragedy that we're in, or out of white supremacy, or out of patriarchy, or out of, just name it, right? What we're, it's our imaginations, right? And I think, years ago, I once asked during one of our years of V-Day, just everybody to imagine what it'd be like to live in a world where there was no violence. What would their days be like? How would their lives be different? And to be honest, there were many people who couldn't. I was actually working at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for a long time, and I did this exercise with a group of writers in my group, and one woman just broke down crying, and she said she couldn't possibly do that. That even the thought of that would be too painful. She just couldn't even let herself try to imagine it because she would be so let down. And I think so much of what you're calling for in this book is this project of imagination, right? And I really wonder, can we release the chains that are on our own imaginations to really say, what would it mean to live in a world where we didn't need the police? And I would just love you to talk about, what does it mean to develop and evolve a community of care?
Okay.
And what would it really look like? What would it look like for you? What would the world look like if we no longer needed the police? Because I think we need to stretch our imaginations to break through our own self-imposed limitations.
Yes. Well, I'm gonna, if it's okay, I would like to respond to the first part of the question around imagination. And it was through this book that I realized that imagination, well, this is not true. Partially, I think in 2019, I guess it's 2019. Yeah, I went to this conference, Making and Unmaking Mass Incarceration. And I was taking all these notes. And then through the book, I started to make sense of some of those notes. And one of the notes that I wrote was that imagination is neutral, right? It's neutral. And I think that I had this romantic idea that imagination is what people who believe in freedom and justice, that's what we do. We dream, we imagine, it's this beautiful project of creation. But police are also imagined, right? They're a fixture of someone's imagination. So are cuffs and cages. Like, these are all manifestations of someone's imagination to do incredible harm, right? And so violence is also imagination that becomes real. It's learned. It's something that can be replicated, right? And so as much as I think that abolition calls on us to imagine our own ways of being in the world, it also is a rejection of other kinds of imagination. It's a no to, we don't want that kind of imagination because it's not liberatory. It doesn't bring us closer to desire and love and intimacy and justice, right? So we actually have to reject. I saw this drone weapon that was created to stop Palestinian activists from like rising up, and it dropped like 4 cans of tear gas canisters, like 4 canisters fell from this drone. And I was like, wow, there were engineers who went to school, who got a job, sat down and designed a drone device to drop 4 cans of tear gas at the same time to stop people from like resisting, right? That's someone's imagination. And it's we either have to have a greater imagination, a more robust imagination, but more importantly, we have to have the political, spiritual, emotional will to make our imagination manifest. Right? Like we have to do both. I think that if we don't do both, the people who have the imagination to do violence, to maintain colonialism, to maintain capitalism, to maintain prisons and police, they also have the will to make sure police continue to get funded. right? They have the will and the resources to make sure that drones continue to be developed to drop tear gas canisters, to imagine tanks and new kinds of guns and new kinds of armor. They have the imagination and they have the will and they have the resources. So we have to have all of that and more if we're actually going to do this fight.
That is so beautifully put. So beautifully put. And I think there's something I was thinking a lot about how patriarchy is so connected to this quote need for the police. It's the need for that, to be honest with you, the need for the violent father, the need for the violent protector, right? And I think part of unpacking and unraveling the police is also unraveling patriarchy. And maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, the violent father in the household is absolutely simple. I guess is that I think that in Aya Gruber's book, which is great, it's called The Feminist War on Crime. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I think it is an example of that. So Aya, in her book, she details how like the Anti-White Slave Trafficking Act, like the fight to end white slavery, which was a fight to usually stop a lot of white women who were sex workers or forced into prostitution to get out of it. It sent police on this mission to like rescue white women. And oftentimes, especially for white women who were sex workers or who had relationships with Black men, it would put them in a position to be prosecuted if they decided to be with a person of color or with an immigrant or someone who wasn't desirable. And so this patriarchal response to go and rescue white women didn't actually stop what made white people, white women especially, vulnerable to being kidnapped if they were, or vulnerable to being, sold into traffic, to being trafficked, right? And so when white women were fighting for, voting rights or like to be able to work or like sexual liberation, the police were not championing those. No, they were not we were not trying to give them more resources to make sure they had agency. Instead, they put them in insane asylums if they wanted to divorce their husbands. This is the maintaining of the patriarchal order. And so what capitalism does on top of all that, it creates jobs predicated on the exclusion of people from the economy. So if women are excluded from the economy, not only does it give men more jobs, right? It also gives police jobs to then manage women who are not in the economy, right? So then you're essentially creating a jobs program for all these patriarchal pursuits. And so that legacy, it just continues today. And so we have to fight patriarchy. We can't just hire more women cops because the institution is patriarchal. And I know there's like an impulse, we just need nice women cops with empathy who can, de-escalate better than men. It's like, well, the system that they're upholding is still rotten, right? And so we shouldn't just try to make it more diverse. We should try to eliminate our reliance on the system and then to also reduce it altogether.
Yes. I think we only have time for one more question, but I think it's a good question to maybe close this with. Harrison asks, do you see hope for the abolitionist movement anywhere in the world?
Yes, I see it right here, right now, right here and right now. Absolutely. I am so inspired and so encouraged by the shift in the demands, even from 2014 to 2020. In 2014, there were so many activists, including me, who were going into the streets and saying, we just need body cameras. We just need better relationships with police. They just need to understand us. They just need to see us as human. If they only saw us as human, then maybe, just maybe, they won't hurt us. To go from that in 2014 to go to 2020, where the primary demand in the streets was defund the police, so much so that it made both presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, commit to giving more resources for the police as a response. I think that is absolutely hopeful in the US and beyond. Learning how people in other countries are connecting abolition to decolonization, right, to the fight to end borders. I think if there's any time to be hopeful for the abolitionist movement. It's especially now. And that's because there were so many people who decided to write about it, talk about it, organize under it for decades to make this moment possible. And we need the courage right now to continue that work so that world will be possible, even if we aren't here to see it.
Beautiful. And just leave everyone with, what can we do? What can people do? Like, what is the, yeah.
Yes. If I had a dream, right? If I had a dream, one thing I actually do hope, this is the book. I love this book so much.
Get this book, everybody. It's really a game-changing book, and I cannot recommend it enough. I just
No, thank you. The reason why I wrote the book this way is because there are so many organizations listed in this book, so many scholars, so many activists, so many different kinds of ideas. If abolition is still like, I'm not sure, but you're excited about feminism or disability justice or climate justice, there's something here for you. So I would hope that people continue to get engaged through political study and join or support the organization. Those are the two most important things I think that we can do right now. Learn more to develop a political analysis, which means that you're reading and struggling and thinking through some of these concepts with other people, not just by yourself. And to find a campaign, to find an organization that's doing abolitionist work that you care about, that you can either join or support.
And I want to just remind everybody that it's a journey. It's a process. It's of evolution and opening your mind and changing. And just commit yourself to that journey the way our brilliant Derecka has. And she's taken us there. And I just thank you so much for this conversation, for your brilliance, your devotion, for your passion. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. So I'm like blushing. My cheeks hurt so much from smiling. Thank you for your generosity and just taking such care with the book and taking the ideas seriously, because, people have been grinding for this for decades. And I just feel lucky to be a part of that tradition. So thank you so, so much for honoring it here tonight.
And thank you everyone for listening.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Sounds like that's my cue. Well then, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you for the couple people that put in questions in the chat. I really, really appreciate you. If you'd like to read this book, it's the very, very, very first link that's in the description box just below the video that you're watching right now. You can click it. It'll take you right to our book passage page. If you would like to order it through us, we can ship it to your house. We can ship it to... Make sure to read this. Yeah, absolutely. We will make sure to read this. We can ship it right to your house, just like any other online retailer out there in the world, including the one that we shall not name that is very large. For everybody that happens to be new here, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. And thank you for supporting independent bookstores just like us. Thank you for supporting books just like these and authors just like these two here. But regardless, however long you were here for it, if you want to go back to watch this, you don't have to wait until we post the video. You can just right now take the track bar right across the bottom of the video and scroll it all the way back to the beginning. And you can watch it over again right now if you want. Otherwise, thank you one last time, everybody. Hope to see you all in the next one. Bye.
Bye.